There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You wake up, reach for your phone before your eyes have fully adjusted to the light, and within 60 seconds you've already absorbed someone else's opinion, someone else's outrage, someone else's carefully curated version of reality, and you haven't even thought a single thought of your own yet. That feeling, that low-level static in your mind that never fully goes away, most people assume it's just modern life, just the price of being connected, just how things are now, something you adapt to, something you eventually stop noticing. But the fact that you stop noticing doesn't mean it stops happening. Carl Rogers saw it coming, decades before the algorithm existed, before the infinite scroll, before notifications competed for every spare second of your attention. He understood exactly what was happening to the human mind when it stopped trusting itself. And what he described wasn't a technology problem. It was something far deeper, far older, and far more personal than most people are willing to admit. Think about the last time you had a genuine opinion, not a reaction, not a reflex, but a real, slow-formed thought that came entirely from inside you. Not what you heard someone say, not what the comments agreed on, not the take that got the most engagement, an actual thought, born in silence, shaped by your own experience, and trusted, truly trusted, before you even checked if anyone else agreed. If you're struggling to remember, that's not an accident. Rogers spent his life sitting with people in their most honest moments, not the versions of themselves they showed the world, but the raw, unfiltered, often frightened inner life that most people hide even from themselves. And what he kept seeing, over and over, was the same wound, a person who had learned, somewhere along the way, to distrust their own inner experience, not because they were weak, not because they were broken, but because the world around them had been relentlessly, quietly teaching them to look outward for the truth of who they were. This is where it starts to get uncomfortable, because the process Rogers described wasn't violent or dramatic. It didn't happen through oppression or overt control. It happened through something much softer and much more seductive. It happened through approval. From the very beginning of your life, you were a feeling organism. You experienced hunger and you cried. You felt warmth and you reached toward it. You sensed danger and you pulled back. Your body and your mind were constantly generating information, real, direct, unfiltered information about your experience. Rogers called this the organismic valuing process, the quiet, intelligent signal inside you that knows what feels right, what feels wrong, what nourishes and what diminishes. But then the conditions arrived. Someone important to you, a parent, a teacher, a peer, a culture, made it clear, without words, that certain feelings were acceptable and others were not, that certain reactions earned love and belonging, and others earned disappointment or distance. And because belonging is not optional for a human being, because connection is survival, you made the only rational choice available to you. You started editing yourself, not consciously, not deliberately. You simply began filtering your inner experience through the question that would follow you for the rest of your life. What will they think? If you're honest with yourself right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know the feeling of swallowing something true because the room wasn't safe enough to say it. You know the performance of enthusiasm you put on when you felt nothing inside. You know the version of yourself that exists in certain social situations, composed, agreeable, legible, and how different that person feels from whoever it is you are when no one's watching. That gap between who you are and who you've learned to perform, Rogers called incongruence, and he believed it was the source of most human suffering. But here's what he couldn't have fully imagined. What happens when the entire architecture of modern life is built to widen that gap? Because what social media did, what the attention economy does at its most fundamental level, is industrialize the exact mechanism Rogers spent his career diagnosing. It didn't create the wound, it just built an entire infrastructure around it. Every like is a tiny moment of conditional positive regard. Every comment is a micro-evaluation of your acceptability. Every piece of content you consume is someone else's framing of reality, delivered with enough emotional charge to feel like your own thought. Until you stop being able to tell the difference, And the machinery doesn't stop there. Because it's not just about what you post or what you say, it's about what you consume silently, hour after hour, day after day. Every video that tells you what to think about a public figure, every headline engineered to make you feel something before you've had a chance to understand anything, every trending topic that creates a social pressure so ambient, so constant, that disagreeing with it starts to feel not just wrong but personally dangerous. That's not an accident. That's the architecture working exactly as designed. If this channel has ever made you stop and look inward rather than outward, consider subscribing, not because of the number, but because there's something quietly radical about choosing to return to spaces that take your inner life seriously. Think about what happens to your thinking when you spend hours inside that environment. Not your surface thoughts, your deep thinking, the kind of slow, uncertain, generative cognition that requires silence and discomfort and the willingness to not know something for a while. Rogers understood that genuine growth requires a specific internal condition. He called it being a fully functioning person, and one of its core features is openness, the ability to receive your own experience, including the difficult and confusing parts, without immediately defending against it or reshaping it to fit what's expected. But the feed doesn't allow for that. The feed punishes ambiguity. It rewards certainty, reaction, and the performance of already knowing. It selects, relentlessly, for the shrinking of your inner life. And the terrifying part, the part Rogers would have found most devastating, is that most people don't feel like something is being taken from them. They feel stimulated. They feel engaged. They feel, in some distorted way, like they're thinking more than ever, when in reality, they are thinking less and reacting more, processing less and performing more, trusting their inner experience less, and outsourcing their sense of reality more. This isn't stupidity in the way the word is usually used. It's not about intelligence. It's about something Rogers considered far more important: psychological aliveness, the capacity to be genuinely present to your own experience, to let reality land in you before you decide what it means, to form responses that come from somewhere real inside you rather than from the ambient pressure of collective opinion. That capacity is being systematically eroded, not through malice, through design. And the worst part, most of us are participating willingly. There's a particular moment Rogers wrote about, a moment he considered one of the most quietly profound things that can happen to a person. It's the moment when someone, in the middle of a conversation or a private silence, suddenly hears themselves say something they didn't know they thought. Not a rehearsed opinion, not a borrowed perspective, something that emerged, uncertain and alive, from a place they hadn't been in a very long time. That moment, that contact with your own inner signal, is exactly what the modern environment is structured to prevent. Not because anyone decided to prevent it, but because it doesn't perform well. It doesn't generate engagement. It's too slow, too uncertain, too deeply personal to go viral. If something in this is landing for you, if you're starting to feel something shift, pause for a moment. What's actually moving in you right now? Not what you'd say in a comment. What's actually there? Because Rogers believed, and this is perhaps the most radical thing he ever said, that the human organism, left to genuine self-contact, naturally moves toward health. Not perfection, not ease, but towards something more real, more integrated, more alive. The problem was never that people couldn't think. The problem was that they had been taught, over and over, to distrust what thinking actually felt like from the inside. Thinking from the inside is messy. It contradicts itself. It sits with questions that don't resolve. It changes its mind not because someone argued it down, but because something new was genuinely felt. It's uncomfortable in a way that productive discomfort always is. The kind of discomfort that means you're actually somewhere real. What the feed gives you instead is the sensation of thinking without the substance of it. The emotional texture of conviction without the process that earns conviction. The feeling of being informed without the slow, uncertain work of actually forming understanding. And you absorb this difference somewhere below the level of language. You might not be able to name it, but there's a part of you that knows when your thoughts are yours and when they're not. That part of you, the part that still knows the difference, Rogers would say is the most important thing you have. Not your productivity, not your social legibility, not your ability to keep up with the discourse, your capacity to be in genuine contact with your own inner experience. That's the thing being slowly traded away, and most people don't notice until the silence finally arrives, the quiet Sunday, a long drive, a moment without distraction, and they realize they don't know what they actually think about anything anymore. Not because they're not smart, but because they haven't been alone with themselves in a very long time. And this is what makes Roger's insight so unsettling even now, maybe especially now. He wasn't describing a failure of willpower or discipline. He wasn't saying people were lazy or shallow. He was saying something much more tender than that. He was saying that people had become strangers to themselves, not out of negligence, but out of a kind of survival. That the self-abandonment was logical, that it made sense given the conditions, that somewhere deep inside, every person who performed and conformed and filtered and shrunk was doing the only thing that seemed safe. That recognition that the loss of yourself was rational changes the quality of how you hold it. It's not a character flaw, it's a response. It's what happens when the environment consistently rewards the performance of a self over the inhabiting of one. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. Rogers believed the path back wasn't dramatic. It didn't require grand transformation or radical withdrawal. It required something much simpler and much harder: the willingness to slow down enough to actually hear yourself, to sit with an uncomfortable feeling without immediately narrating it for an audience that doesn't exist, to hold an uncertain opinion long enough to discover what you actually believe, to let your experience be real before it becomes content. There's something profound about the act of choosing, even briefly, to not immediately share what you're feeling, to let an experience belong to you before it belongs to anyone else, to resist the reflex of translation, turning every private thing into something legible, shareable, readable. Rogers called this process becoming a person, not becoming better, not becoming more successful or more admired or more optimized, just more real, more congruent, more genuinely inhabited by the life that is actually yours. And congruence, in his framework, wasn't about being consistent in how you present yourself to the world. It was about the alignment between what you experience internally and what you allow yourself to be aware of. It was about closing the gap, not performing it closed, but actually feeling less fractured inside. Most people have never experienced what that feels like for more than a few moments at a time. And those moments, a conversation that went somewhere true, a walk that produced a thought that surprised them, a piece of music that landed somewhere they hadn't expected. Those moments feel different, fuller, more solid, more like being alive than anything the feed has ever provided. That feeling is data. Your organism is telling you something, and what it's telling you is not complicated, even if it's difficult. It's telling you that there is a difference between a life that is lived and a life that is performed, that you can feel the difference in your body even when you can't articulate it in words, that somewhere beneath the noise and the speed and the endless demand for your attention, there is a self that is waiting, not dramatically, not urgently, but patiently, for you to come back to it. Rogers observed this in person after person across decades of practice. People who arrived in his presence believing they were fundamentally broken, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally unworthy of their own inner experience. And what he found, consistently, was that when those people were offered an environment of genuine acceptance, when someone simply reflected back to them that what they felt was real and worth attending to, something began to move. Something began to reorganize itself toward coherence, not because he fixed them, but because he stopped requiring them to be different from what they were. That quality of attention, the kind that doesn't demand you edit yourself in order to be received, is almost entirely absent from the modern media environment. What you get instead is an environment that is constantly, subtly, asking you to be more palatable, more extreme, more certain, more legible, more like whatever version of you gets the most response. And every time you comply, even slightly, even unconsciously, the distance between you and your actual experience grows a little wider. What's strange is that this compliance rarely feels like loss. It feels like participation. It feels like belonging. And that's precisely what makes it so effective, because the hunger for belonging is real. It's not a weakness. It's one of the most deeply human things about you. The tragedy isn't that you wanted to be accepted. The tragedy is that the environment learned to exploit that wanting, to turn it into a mechanism for keeping you permanently outside of yourself. Rogers understood that the antidote to this wasn't isolation or rejection of connection. It was a different quality of connection entirely, one where you didn't have to shrink in order to enter the room. If this conversation stirred something in you, a memory, a recognition, something you haven't put into words yet, the comments section exists for something other than performance. Share what actually came up, not the polished version, the real one. And if you haven't yet, subscribing and leaving a like genuinely helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most. There's a version of your mind that exists before the feed gets to it. It's slower. It's less certain. It tolerates not knowing. It forms thoughts over days, not seconds. It can hold to contradictory things at once without needing to collapse them into a take. That mind is still in you. It didn't disappear. It just went quiet under the noise. Rogers spent his life creating conditions where that mind could speak again. Conditions of warmth, of non-judgment, of patient attention. He believed that given those conditions, something in a person would naturally begin to unfold, not toward what they were supposed to be, but toward what they actually were. And the most subversive implication of everything he believed is this: that underneath the performance, underneath the adaptation, underneath all the layers of learned acceptability, there is something in you that is oriented toward truth, that wants contact with reality, that is, at its core, built for genuine experience rather than simulated connection. The system doesn't want you to believe that, because a person in contact with their own inner signal is much harder to manipulate, harder to sell to, harder to outrage, harder to keep scrolling. A person who trusts their own experience doesn't need nearly as much external validation to feel real, and that, more than anything, might be why this particular idea, the idea that you are the most reliable source of information about your own life, feels so quietly dangerous in the current moment. Maybe the most radical act available to you right now isn't a new habit or a better system, or a digital detox. Maybe it's just this: the willingness to stay with your own experience long enough to find out what's actually there. Not what you've been told to feel, not what performs well, not what fits the narrative inherited from 1,000 invisible sources competing for your attention. What's actually, quietly, honestly there? That question doesn't resolve quickly. It shouldn't, because a question that stays open keeps you honest in a way that a neat answer never could. It keeps you in motion, still becoming something, still unfolding, still capable of surprising yourself when you look without flinching. And that knowing, that faint, persistent signal underneath all the noise, Rogers would say it was there all along. You just have to be willing to listen.